Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. If I could have your attention, please. On behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion with Marjan H. Ehsassi about her latest release, Activated Citizenship, the transformative power of citizens' assemblies. We can clap and celebrate. That's what we're here for. Thank you, thank you. If you don't know anything about us, Busboys and Poets is a community where racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our Busboys and Poets servers are going to be helping us out throughout the entire program with putting in orders, so we encourage you to eat, order as much as you like. The AC in this room can be a bit loud turning on and off, so just be prepared for that. If we want to cool down the room a little bit, it will just continue the conversation. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion, so make sure to be thinking about those questions, preparing for that. And a book signing at the end of the program, and Activated Citizenship is here available for purchase. And a little bit about the book we'll be discussing here tonight. Drawing on extensive field research across 4 countries, author Marjan H provides in-depth case studies of citizens' assemblies in France, Belgium, Canada, and the United States. Through surveys, interviews, and participant observation, she developed an innovative framework for examining civic engagement across the 5 key dimensions: learning, connectedness and belonging, enthusiasm, political activity, and consequential voice. At a time when many are questioning the health of our society, from an epidemic of loneliness and lack of belonging, division and polarization, to disengagement from political institutions, this book offers practical solutions and both hope for civic renewal. And now a little bit about the speaker we have here with us tonight. Marjan H. Ehsassi is the Executive Director of FIDE North America, the Federation for Innovation in Democracy, North America. She is a Future of Democracy Fellow at the Bergen Institute, a Senior Innovations Fellow at the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, and on the Democratic Innovations Governing Council of the American Political Science Association. A former litigator, she is a skilled advocate, strategic policy advisor, and a movement builder. She has been deeply involved in the research, design, and implementation of several citizens' assemblies in France, Belgium, and Canada, and the US. She served as one of the 4 guarantors of the French Citizens Convention on the End of Life and on the Oversight Committee of the G1000 We Need to Talk Citizens panels. Now I'll pass it off to her. Thank you so much. Turn the switch. Here, let me help with that. No problem.
Oh, sideways? Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Madison. And thank you, all of you, for spending your Sunday evening here with us. I really, truly, it's a pleasure to be here. I do want to say a few thanks. I'd like to thank Andy and Marjan Shalal, the owners of Busboys and Poets. I'm sorry that they couldn't be here with us tonight, but Busboys and Poets and the remarkable team that they have has really, truly been a pillar of our community. I remember when my kids were younger, we would be here every time they'd come back from a trip so that they could tell their stories after we were working with Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. And truly, I think this space, and I didn't realize until I arrived today that they're celebrating their 20th anniversary this September, has really, really been a place where I think many of us have felt a sense of community and also belonging and purpose. I also want to thank my family. There are lots of family members. I was going to name you, but there are many of you, and so thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I also want to thank Sogan Seyrafi, who's sitting here, who truly, I think it's because of your friendship. Can you hear, is it that? Thanks to your friendship and your support that we're all here. And finally, all of you, as I was sort of driving here, I was thinking there is really a different sense of excitement and promise when someone speaks in your own city and you're talking to people who live in your community, live in your neighborhood. There's a different excitement. And so thank you to each and every one of you for being here. I also want to point out to Avram, who's receiving his dinner, who's sitting right here. Avram and I have been working on a concept for a hub in Washington, D.C. for citizens' assemblies. And so please, if you feel inspired by the conversation tonight, please come and see one of us, and we have a little sign-up sheet right there, and we'd love for you to be involved with us. So I think, as I was thinking about sort of how to talk about this here tonight, I think that for far too long, the American public has been given two choices, two untenable choices. Either we need to defend our democracy, which is very real, or we need to destroy our democracy. And I think that what I'd like to sort of discuss with you tonight is a third option, which is that of demanding reform. I think it's time that we really come together and we think about thoughtful, measured, deliberative ways that we can really bring reform to our democracy. And so I really appreciate the spaces that are created like this one tonight, where we can talk about that a little bit more. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and your feedback and how this sits with you, and so I thought I would speak for about 20 minutes or so, take you through my journey, how I came here, and then a little bit more about sort of the democratic deficits as we see it in the work that we do at FIDE North America, and then of course the solution. It is one solution, it is not the solution. I always like to say it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but it is something that can truly complement and strengthen our representative democracies. So how did I get here? As Madison kindly mentioned, I'm a former litigator. I've had many twists in my career. I moved to the US actually almost 30 years ago to be a litigator. I'm from Iran originally and did my legal studies in Canada, and then moved to New York City to practice law. That didn't last very long. And we moved to Washington, D.C. I was really looking for something that was a little bit more mission-driven. And so I moved into international development. I worked at the World Bank for a while. I worked at the National Democratic Institute, at the American Bar Association, always going around the world trying to strengthen other democracies and doing governance work and rule of law work. And that was working quite well until 2016. And then 2016, I really didn't feel like I could justify going around the world doing this work when it felt to me like our own democracy really needed some attention. And so I went back to school. I went to Johns Hopkins SAIS to do my doctoral degree. And the problem statement for me back then, and the sort of the genesis of the book, was really one question, and that was, why are the residents of more developed Western democracies so disengaged from political institutions? And are there solutions out there that once you participate in them make you want to engage with your political institutions more? So that was really the problem statement for me. And as I was doing that work and doing the research around sort of what those reasons might be, the research really cohered around three deficits. One of them is our very, very minimalistic definition of our democracy. I mean, if you look at the United States and you ask people how they express their voice, it's often their vote. We, every 2 years, every 4 years, we're invited to come and vote, and we can hold people and parties and candidates accountable in those processes, and that's really it. There isn't very much and very many ways for us at large. I mean, I know that there are some communities, some cities, and I would love to talk to you about those, especially if you're from those cities, because we can learn from them. But often, we don't really have meaningful platforms for voice. So that's one part, and I actually was just speaking at the American Democracy Summit this past week in Phoenix, and I will say to you that while the organizers did a tremendously wonderful job, 60 to 70% of those panels were around elections and electoral reform. And so, even the organizations and the people that we look to really start thinking about innovative ways to do our democratic work are still really stuck in this kind of in this mind frame. And so I do think that we need to start thinking more about creating spaces for people in between elections. The second deficit that we see very much in the work that we do is the lack of policy congruence. What do we mean by that? Like, very simply, that is the reality that people do not feel that their policy preferences are reflected in the laws, the regulations that they are asked to live by. So every day, all of us, as part of this democracy, have to live by certain laws. And if those don't reflect your preferences, that is a real problem. And if you look at the data, and I won't go into the details of that with you tonight, but if you look at the data, ever since the 1960s, especially 67, 68, there's a wider and wider separation between what people think are their preferences and the policies that they have to live by. So that is a huge problem. And at FIDE North America, we have an expression and we say we need to put the public back into public policy. And that's really something that we are striving for. The third deficit that I'd like to mention is the fact that we don't hear from marginalized voices across this country. We don't have good systems in place to hear from a diverse range of residents. And even when we talk to elected representatives, whether they're mayors or city managers or governors these days, they will say, my engagement is broken. I'm only hearing from the same people. And yet, we're not bringing in processes that will allow us to reach those more marginalized voices. So those are really the three deficits that we focus on. And I also want to share one other data point with you, which is the University of Maryland did a study, and some of you may be familiar with this, a couple of years ago. And they asked about 4,500 Americans across the US, and this was around congressional elections. And they asked the citizens of the US a bunch of different questions, but something that they did was very different. They introduced a pledge to consult. And they asked people, so if your candidate signed a pledge to consult with constituents post-election, are you more likely to vote for that candidate? And as you would expect, Democrats in the 90s percentile said yes, of course they would, and so did Republicans. And then they asked Democrats if they were more likely to vote for a Republican who made a pledge to consult with constituents. 74% of Democrats said they would, and 69% of Republicans said they would. So in my view, at a time when we have such heightened polarization, a number like that is staggering. And to me, it says that Americans want to be consulted. They want to have real voice. And in the book, I introduced the term voice insecurity, because unlike what a lot of people will say, that, you know, people are apathetic, they don't want to get engaged, they don't care about politics. And I think that's true of a percentage of any public, anywhere in the world. But more, I think, more significantly, there are Americans across this country that are desperate to be more engaged, except they're looking for more meaningful and what I call consequential ways to become more engaged. So I think that, what I wanted to do at this point was maybe talk a little bit about the variables, and then we'll get into the solution. So as I was sitting around doing my research, and for all the political scientists in the room, if there are any of you, I was looking at different variables that I could test against the different platforms and the interventions. And what we talk about usually is political efficacy. And in my view, political efficacy just wasn't sufficient in the ways that we look at the ways that we can engage with people. And at the time, I had no idea that anybody would ever read my variables. But the 5 variables that I ultimately kind of designed and I've incorporated in my research and now in the book, and they're really the 5 areas where I think government has a role. Government has a responsibility to engage with citizens. The very first one is epidemic growth. So I believe that any platform to engage with your residents needs to make them more informed. It needs to introduce balanced information so that people can leave that engagement and feel like they've learned something. So that's the very first variable. The second variable is a sense of connectedness, is that when you bring people together, you need to create an experience that allows people to feel the sense of belonging that we're lacking. I mean, if you look at all the data around the loneliness epidemic that we're feeling in this country, we want to have engagement methods that bring people together and build that sense of community. The third piece, and everybody loves this one, I'm not sure why, was effervescence. So I felt, people should feel excited about their democracy. And so that level of enthusiasm, when your, city manager or your mayor or your governor or your president engages with you in the practice of democracy, you need to leave it feeling excited about what you just did. So that's the fourth one, the third one. The fourth one is just political engagement. Are people kind of talking about politics more as a result of their engagement? Are they reading the newspaper more? Are they volunteering more? And then the fifth, which by now you've probably realized is really important to me, is voice. And that sense of voice, the fact that you've engaged with government and you actually feel that your input was meaningful. So those were all the 5 variables that I used in my book across citizens' assemblies, and I think we're now currently using for all sorts of different learning series as well. So with all of that said, what is the solution? So what I'd love to do with you is actually just ask you to imagine something. Imagine coming home from work one day, and there's an envelope waiting for you, and the envelope has the stamp of the mayor's office. And you open the envelope, and there's an invitation signed by Muriel Bowser, and she is asking you to provide her with input and about what the city should do around the RFK Stadium. She's inviting you to come and join other people, 48 people in total, so you would be one of 48. Come together to learn together, to deliberate together, to write policy proposals for the city to consider in a final report that you will then submit to the mayor, right? How many of you would say yes to that? Most of you, right? Have you ever received a letter like that? No. And why not? Why not? I mean, I think that part of the reason is that our elected representatives, sadly, don't really have a vision, don't really have imagination. And I think something that, if there's interest in this room, we can certainly talk about more, and I've written about, is that I think we often talk about the fact that we don't trust in government, but we very rarely talk about the fact that our government actually doesn't trust us. Our government doesn't trust our input. And I have a very, very close colleague who works in Canada who often talks about the public being kind of used, and not used as a resource, but as a risk. And electeds are often scared of the public. And so citizens' assemblies, and we'll talk about them a little bit more, sort of flips that around. So what is a citizens' assembly? A citizens' assembly, as I was kind of discussing a little bit in the framework of the RFK Stadium Citizens' Assembly, which will never happen, but would be such a great idea, I think, has 4 main components. One, a city authority, whether it's at the very local level, and currently we're working with a lot of cities across the United States, but we also have just received funding to work with governors as well. So whether it's at the city level, at the state level, or at the national level, there is a mandating body that says, I have a problem and I want real input from my constituents or from my residents or from my citizens. So that's the first piece of an assembly. The second component of an assembly is, instead of having sign-up sheets, which is what most electeds currently have to bring people together, we use a process called sortition. So going back to the example I gave you about the RFK Stadium, imagine you were one of 10,000 people who received that letter. So we will send out about 10,000 letters. Sometimes it's 7,000, sometimes it's by text, sometimes it's by email, and we could talk for hours about just the sortition process, and we won't do that. But you typically will send 7,000 to 10,000 letters to a population. And based on the volunteer pool that you then receive, it's a 2-tiered system. You use certain criteria, and the criteria is, the ones that you would expect. It's age, it's gender, it's urban, rural divides, it's education, socioeconomics. We use 6 to 7, 8 different criteria, and we have statisticians that do this work. And so we try and bring together a representative sampling of that city, of that county, of that state. And I will tell you that having worked in having designed and implemented citizen engagement processes for now almost 19 years, there is no other process that brings together a more representative body of people than when you use sortition. And sometimes it's called democratic lottery. So that's the second component. The third component of any citizens' assembly is that there are 3 phases. So the very first phase, and 1/3 of the process, is around education. So people come together, and we can again talk about this for hours, but we curate the evidence and we curate the experts that come so that we do have a broad range of experts that speak. And when I say experts, I don't mean just experts as in academics. We do 3 different groups. We usually have academics who provide, we hope, an unbiased perspective on the issue. It doesn't always happen that way, and there are lots of issues, but that's the hope. And then we bring stakeholders, which are usually community organizations on different sides of the issue, and we try and also bring people with lived experience. And so that's kind of the learning phase. After the learning phase is the deliberation phase, where people in small groups, in large groups, will deliberate with each other, so that they can come up with proposals that will then be included in the final report. So at the end of the day, there's a final report with all the recommendations and the proposals that people have that will then be submitted to that same mandating body. And we can talk about all the different examples. We at FIDE and myself, I'm issue agnostic. We work on all sorts of different issues. We're more kind of on the design side of this work. So those are the different components of what an assembly is. And I will say, I mean, in the book, there are lots of different case studies, but I'll just share with you one citizens' assembly that is not in the book, but I just came back about a month ago now from British Columbia, where again, on Vancouver Island, 2 cities, the city of Saanich and the city of Victoria. One of them is about 95,000 people, the other is about 120,000 people. For about 10 years now, these 2 cities have realized that, well, they've probably realized it for longer, but they've been discussing the fact that people are sharing a lot of the public services. And so does it make sense for these 2 cities to amalgamate? Instead of the mayors making this decision or having a poll that just asks the question, they decided to do a citizens' assembly. So for 6 sessions, 48 residents across Saanich and Victoria came together. They learned together. They met with experts. They deliberated together, and they finally gave their recommendation. And about 78% of them said, yes, the 2 cities should amalgamate. And now it's going to go for a public referendum. So there are all sorts of different models for this. So the book, again, is really more, I mean, I'm more of a design nerd. I love talking and thinking about sort of the way that these processes work, the ways to sort of try and perfect them. They are not perfect as they stand. They're very new. It's a very niche area. I mean, for us, it's really big, but it's very small. And there are about 800 processes that have happened, mostly in Western Europe, in Canada, in Australia, very, very few in the United States, though we're starting to see more interest. Bend, Oregon just had an assembly this year. Fort Collins, Colorado just had an assembly. We're in the process in Boulder, Colorado with another assembly. We are going to have a capacity building school in Akron, Ohio in June because there's Akron, Ohio and the city of Dayton, Ohio are both interested in doing a citizens assembly. 2 days ago, I was on the phone with Richmond, Virginia. They're very interested. They came to our school and they're going to send another team to our next school. So people are starting to talk about it. There's more interest. And I guess I want to end, but I think just something that I guess I would love to maybe leave with you as a thought is that, you know, no matter where you are right now in the United States in terms of your political beliefs, I think one thing that has just in the past year and some with FIDE that I've come to really realize, and it's very unfortunate, but I think that we have lost our respect for process. I think no matter where you are, people, donors, implementers, our political leaders, are far more interested in outcomes than they are in the process of democracy. And I think for me, and I think some of the advocates in this room who I know are also advocates of citizens' assemblies here, I think the beauty of an assembly is that it actually looks at our democracy and says, the beauty of a democracy is about the process. It's not about the result. It's not about whether people agree with me or not, but it's about bringing people together to think about what the policies are that they want their lives to be governed by. And with that, I'll end, and I would love to kind of hear your thoughts, what sits with you, how it sits with you, and we can take this discussion in any direction that you'd like. Thank you.
If you have a question or comment, I'll come pass you the mic. Okay, right here.
Thanks, Marjan. Great talk. For the ones that are in the U.S., what are the issues that the citizens' assemblies here are looking at?
That's a great question. So the very, very first citizens' assembly that we've ever had in the U.S., and I want to sort of put a caveat out there as well. There are organizations, there's one organization in particular called Healthy Democracy that has been doing sortition-based work for quite some time, but they haven't been citizens' assemblies, and I can tell you what they were doing before. But in terms of assemblies, the very first one that we had was in Petaluma, California, and I was a researcher, and the case study is actually in the book. That was the first real citizens' assembly we've had, and that was on land use. So that's the first one. Bend, Oregon was on youth homelessness. Fort Collins was also on land use. So we have this parcel of land. What do residents want us to do with it? Boulder, Colorado, that we've helped design, and we're also on the oversight committee of, is on 15-minute neighborhoods. So the city of Boulder is really interested in asking its residents whether Boulder should have 15-minute neighborhoods, and if so, where and how they should be. Akron, Ohio, I'm not quite sure where it's going to be. Public safety is a big issue in Akron, Ohio, as is childcare. So we're working with the city right now to really think about what that remit should be. But you ask a really good question in the sense that, we have this kind of debate every day. Should we pick topics that are kind of low-hanging fruit to introduce the cities to these things that might be a little bit less risky? Or should we really go for what an assembly is really about, which is really to try and solve the really difficult problems? The country of Ireland is very well known, and we still hold Ireland as the gold standard, really, for citizens' assemblies, though I think that the last French convention that I was a part of on the end of life, if the law does end up changing, I think is the gold standard. In Ireland, they've asked... Yep.
Was that a federal government level? Okay, yeah.
I think that microphone might be dead, so I'm going to switch these out.
Thank you. All right. Oh, that's... Hi. Yes. Yep. Sure, happy to. On the funding issue, I mean, you put your finger on really part of the problem with assemblies. Assemblies are not supposed to answer every issue, right? Every policy issue. They're costly, they're slow, and they're small, right? Because, you know, we sometimes have 150 people, and I can talk about the different numbers that I've worked with, but it's typically, we'll say, above 40, though there are assemblies with 20 people too that I don't think are really it's very hard to make an argument around representation with only 20 people, even if you have a small town. Cost-wise, it differs. So generally, we'll say for an assembly of about 40 people, it's about $150,000 to $200,000. And part of that is because we do offer stipends for the assembly members. And so that's usually what it is. All across Europe, these processes are being paid for by the cities themselves or the national governments. In the United States, even in Canada, national citizens' assemblies are paid for by the institutions that mandate them. In the United States, there is a huge crisis right now because we're looking to philanthropy to fund these assemblies. And I think that's completely wrong. And so we are actually in the process of writing a briefing paper on how these funding models should work. Because there are cities like Boulder that we've been helping where we're trying to create a model where, first of all, the city is paying for it. Like, you want the city to have skin in the game. And yes, maybe you raise some money from philanthropy, but that shouldn't be 100% or 80% of the funds that are available, necessary. And so we're trying to create different models to make this still really kind of have the principles of assemblies really well respected and well functioning, but to bring down the costs. Because a couple of these assemblies in the United States have cost $450,000, which, you know, I mean, we open, what we look like, I mean, I will say, I mean, there is also the other side, right? We're spending money on so many other things that $450,000 on an assembly, we certainly have the resources in this country to do that. It's a question of priorities, right? So we look at citizen engagement processes and we want them to cost very little. But I don't think that should be the case, right? Our North Star, we should prioritize these types of engagement processes. But I'm not sure that I'm taking the conversation in different directions, and I'm sorry. But typically we will say, and we will implement process. I mean, we're not implementers at FIDE, we help implementers, and we sort of build the capacity of cities and places to do this. But the budgets that we work with are typically no more than 150 to 200,000 for a process that is actually significant. On the trust issue, so first of all, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I do think, I mean, I think that electeds, you know, feel that they were elected to speak for the people. And that I do think there's a sense that the average citizen shouldn't actually be making policy proposals. And I don't think that the average citizen thinks that their policies should be binding on government. And these processes, and I should have mentioned this, are consultative. So everywhere in the world, the proposals are not binding on the government, but what we do want government to do is to show follow-up. So there is follow-through, there are mechanisms within 6 months they'll respond to the people and say what they're taking, what they're not taking. I think that, you know, I think that if electeds and if government trusted people more, they would be seeking more input. And we're not seeing that. And I also just have a more fundamental problem with sort of measuring the health of our democracy around people's trust in their political institutions. I find it incredibly paternalistic. What I have seen from these processes is, you know, one, yes, people might trust government more because, you know, if government holds its promise, yes, trust does go up and we have the data to support that. But two, I've seen every time that electeds have come to observe a citizens' assembly, they will say, wow, like, people are actually really committed. Like, people are really smart. And it used to be kind of cute, and now it's really annoying to me because, of course, people are dedicated. People are committed. In France, we had 185 people come and spend 27 days, 9 weekends of their life to address the issue of the end of life and euthanasia. We lost one person of 185 people, and that's because that one person didn't have a job and then found a job and couldn't join us anymore. 184 people came to Paris from all over the country, plus they were from Martinique, from Réunion. They came because they cared and they were committed to this. So the other piece, Leila, that I'll just mention is that I also think, like going back to the concept of trust as the measure of a healthy democracy, to me, what citizens' assemblies do is that they make you trust yourself and your place in your democracy. And to me, that is far more valuable than whether I trust my elected representative or whether I trust the government that you know, I want people to feel, and that's why the book is Activated Citizenship, I want people to feel like they understand how they can contribute to their democracies. But I would love to hear your thoughts about trust. Yep. Right. Well, I mean, I think the platforms that you're pointing to, and I completely agree with you, but those platforms, again, what they're missing is the sortition piece, right? So you have people on those platforms who have time, who have grievances, right? And so it's the usual way of engaging with people. And so what we're proposing with citizens' assemblies, there are two elements that, well, actually 3 or 4 elements that your platform doesn't have. One is it's commissioned by government. You're asking people to come and actually work on one issue together. And I will tell all of you, like every single one of these assemblies, people will say at the end, you know what's really interesting is I don't even know if the person who is sitting at the table with me, I don't know what their party affiliation is. We're just here to solve a local problem. So that's one piece. The second piece is the learning piece. Like sitting together and not starting to argue and debate, but learning together before you start actually talking to each other about your position is a game changer. And we see the ways with the data demonstrates how people come to the middle, people change. I mean, there are always, I always say, like this is always a joke, but you know, when you're working with 100 people or 80 people or 40 people, every one of our societies has, what, 5 to 10% of people who are just troublemakers. So we get those in citizens' assemblies as well. But what's also amazing is their voices are shut off after a while. People do not listen to those people. They know that they're there to just like, they have their grievances, they're always complaining. So I think the learning piece is huge. I think the sortition piece is huge. And I do think that's why the electeds who come and see people working together to solve these problems, their view of the public changes. Of course.
Now we have this person right here, and this mic is actually wired, so if you feel comfortable just projecting, you can do that, or you can come up and use this mic. Yeah, either way.
Sorry.
Hello, Marjan. Thank you. I'm originally from California, and I love that you said that it's not just about elections, because I've never worked on election, but I worked on massive statewide campaigns for the census to get over 38.8 million people in California to answer. And we did what we called convenings, because the census doesn't just count citizens, so we had to, use our nomenclature. And we used the data, divided the state up. It's a huge state. How do you count 40 million people? One bite at a time. How do you eat an elephant? So we divided the state up using data, and then we had 25 convenings. This is in 2018, before the 2020 census. And we brought the community together, because I knew that you have to have community before you can solve problems. And we allowed them from nonprofits to electeds, and it was a readiness assessment. Is your community ready for X? Are they ready to be counted, and why? People don't care about the census. It happens every 10 years. So it's this re-education each time. Very small budget to do 25 convenings all over the state. I was on the road the whole time. I had my GIS guy, and I had like one person from Sac State Center for Collaborative Policy. What happened from that, people said, why would you waste that much money going around and talking to everyone? Because when I did get money from the legislature, and this is a state investing, they said, you get $3 million. And I went around, I said, okay, all you communities, we're gonna get $3 million. And they got together to where in less than 9 months, I had $187 million from the state to say, we need to do this right. And so then we created these trusted ecosystems through convenings or assemblies, whatever you would call them. They came up with culturally relevant in language. We brought the knowledge that the US Census Bureau, who I just finished working for, was not going to count Californians in the way that they needed. They created coalitions along with me at the state. We funded it to make sure that the communities came up with a solution to get the Hmong people who don't have a written language in Siskiyou connected with the Hmong folks all the way in Fresno. And the state had a role of connectivity. And so we basically created these trusted messenger ecosystems throughout this large state. And as soon as COVID hit, everything shut down, but they had built relationships. So unlike the 49 other states who were like, oh my God, what do? We're gonna go, knock on doors and do bake sales. They were immediately flipped onto Zoom and then created, it outpaced the nation in terms of response rates. And then they flipped into harm reduction because we built those actually grassroots. So there's really good examples, and California is one of them, where if you use the trusted messenger ecosystems, because they know each other, you can get better engagement. And so out of 187, I spent 100 million on the ground game. Only 60 million went to fight mis and disinformation, and then of course translation of materials. But it fundamentally was a $100 million ground game that's now continued. So that's, I think, something you should take a look at, because they're continuing even though the budgets are going down for fire safety, drought, all the different things. There's always a public policy that impacts.
Right.
And we focused on the hardest to count, the hardest to enumerate, the underserved populations.
Right.
Because the other people like us, we're going to fill it
That's
out.
great.
But
That's
it's
great.
the people who are underserved. So
Thank
just,
you.
there's
No,
a great
I appreciate that greatly. Yeah, no, I mean, I thank you for sharing that. I will say also on the funding piece, and we talk about how expensive these things are, but and it feels kind of wrong to say this right now given the context and given the past 100 days in our country, but one of the things that I do write about is that we don't have a national endowment for US democracy. So many of us have worked with the National Endowment for Democracy doing international work, and when I was at NDI, the NED was receiving about $150 million from Congress. They don't have to write a grant, it goes straight from Congress to the NED. And the NED was actually set up by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And so when I was writing the conclusion of my book, I thought to myself, well, I wonder how much the NED is kind of getting from Congress these days. $350 million, which is great. I mean, they do incredible work, as does USAID. And so I always feel funny talking about it now because, of course, these institutions that are really important have been decimated. But also, shame on us as a country, given the fact that our democracy has been in disrepair for actually about at least 10 years, if not 15, 20 years, that we don't have a similar institution that would provide funding for US democracy programs. So I think that's important. We actually have a website that we've created called DAF. It's the Democratic Action Fund. And we're asking a government somewhere, and we're having some conversations. Belgium was actually interested, but they haven't done this, to put about 5 to 7% of the money that's spent on elections aside for civic engagement processes. And I mean, the numbers that are spent in the United States on elections are staggering. It would be a drop in the bucket to be able to do real engagement with people. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I also just wanted to mention that citizens, we do, as well with citizens assemblies, we use the term citizens broadly. So it's not just, I mean, we invite people who are not sort of legal citizens, but just more broadly citizens. And that has been an issue, sort of changing the name to civic assemblies, and they are using civic assembly in the US quite often, actually. Yes.
Yes, right here. Would you like to come up or?
Hi, Marjan. I have two questions, and I don't want to presume there's full-on DC residents here, but
Some Baltimore. There's Baltimore
that
presence
makes
too.
total sense to me. But I'm curious if you would outline for the group a vision of how this could look in DC. And secondly, I'm curious about how you feel, based on your expertise, about crowdfunding a portion of this in the U.S. context.
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions, Rhonda. I think in DC, so again, I'm looking at some colleagues who are here. Our work is only government mandated work. So we don't do grassroots citizens assemblies, but that's a real possibility, right? We could do, you're talking about government. So, you know, based on the past year since we launched FIDE, we have talked to the mayor's office. We have talked to city council members. I've talked to my own city council member around the National Cathedral, and you know their eyes kind of glaze over. Other city council members as well, even those who, to be honest, are young and you would think would have more of a sense of a vision or imagination. So it's been rather disappointing. It's been disappointing. Council Member White, I would like to give him a shout out. He and his office and his team have been, is he your council member? Oh no, okay. Okay, yes. So he has been quite interested and quite supportive. But we haven't moved forward, right? I mean, I was really disappointed, and I feel like I can say this in this room, that, you know, as I was really thinking RFK Stadium would be a great idea, I heard that those decisions have been made, and it's more business and developers, and so there will not be, I mean, there'll be a token, I'm sure, engagement process for the residents of DC, but it will not be meaningful, which is really disappointing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So disappointing. Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough to be able to really give you ideas. Some of the topics that we have talked to them about is about housing affordability. I mean, housing affordability is a problem across this country, and it's one that we could do state level work on, local level work on. I don't know. I mean, I'll also say, I mean, I think that, and this is kind of just, you know, this past year has been really hard because there isn't a lot of interest where there should be interest. But I also, you know, I also feel, and we were talking about this, that the American Democracy Summit this week, I think that, you know, I also could not have imagined that our organization would make so much progress and have so much progress in 1 year. And so I think that while it's really frustrating and all of us are pretty impatient, we're still making progress. And I think it's a long game that we're playing. But I don't know. I'm hoping, I mean, I think the mayor's office will not budge. Though her staff has been interested and they've been engaging with us and reaching out. We've had several conversations. But yeah. So sorry, I don't really have any great ideas. About crowdsourcing, so we are actually in conversation with change.org because they would like to work with us, and they're sending 3 people to our school in Akron. The CEO has been very interested. He reached out to me about almost a year ago, and we've had several conversations. And so they would like to create. The problem with that, Rhonda, though, is, so what they're thinking is to create a petition system where there could also be crowdsourcing. And as someone who cares about the policy impact of these citizens' assemblies, I think the most perfect union, the most beautiful marriage of assemblies is where a government has a problem and there's opening to ask citizens. Because otherwise, if it's just the residents of DC who come up with a petition and okay, so the government says we'll lead something, if there isn't going to be real policy impact and there isn't that hunger from government to get feedback, it's a bit of a tricky balance. So I think what we'd like to do with change.org is to work with cities and mayors of cities or city managers where they give us 3 different topics, right? So these are the 3 topics that we're willing to change policy on. Then we ask the residents to vote on the topic that is of most interest to them, because we want them to have that sense of ownership, and then we could use those platforms to try and crowdfund as well. But thanks for the question.
Okay, over here, would you like to come up or just speak out?
I love these questions. I can hear you.
Where you have communities that transcend borders, like Windsor and Detroit, have you looked at how communities join forces on common interests?
We haven't yet, Neil. You mean working with the mayors to do that work?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if there are opportunities like Saanich and Victoria, for instance, I think those would be great ways to do this. Currently, we haven't worked beyond cities, and then, as I mentioned, I don't know if I was descriptive enough, but we received funding to work with governors as well. So we are hoping to bring a coalition of governors together, and in that case, obviously, there would be overlap between the cities and all of that work. But no, we haven't done that. That's an interesting idea. But there hasn't been any kind of, there haven't been bordering cities that have kind of raised that as a possibility for us. Yeah.
I'm just curious about, given that civic assembly is struggling to lower costs, and also there's perceived issue of convenience that some people might not be able to respond because they don't want to take time off work or something like that.
Mhm.
Has there been any motion to consider moving civic assemblies online, at least to bring some of that components to make them more accessible? Or would that have too much of an impact on the core mechanisms that you mentioned? So what does the future of civic assembly look like from a
I think that's a great question, and it's one that we talk about, and my tech friends are all about online assemblies and online deliberation. And so there's a lot of work that's being done in that space. I think the question really serious is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think that if the problem that you're trying to solve is one of social cohesion and community building, then an online platform doesn't really give you that. And we've tested with them, and they really don't. But if the issue is really one of policy impact and you're just looking for people to come together, deliberate, and propose some recommendations, then absolutely you can do online. The other piece of that is that what we're trying to do is create hybrid models. So there are assemblies that we're doing, and they're also being done in the US and in Canada as well, where some sessions are in person so that you have that aspect of social kind of community building, but some of it is also online. And that does help reduce costs. It removes some accessibility as well, because there are people who can't come to the assemblies. So yeah, it does answer for some of those issues. But most of the people that we ask, I mean, I was involved with the European Commission does citizens panels, and these are like magnificent processes. They bring people from the 24 European EU countries together with translators. I mean, it is, and it's 150 people. And the one that I was at was Hatred in Society. And at the end, you know, these are people who are coming from their countries for 6 sessions to Brussels to deliberate and then write the proposals. And the question was asked, we've heard that some of you would prefer to do this online. Can we have a show of hands? And no one raised their hand. Everyone prefers, I think, for the most part, to come and meet in person. But it's a great question, for cost especially.
Okay, see you over here.
Yes. Yes. Mhm. I love the way you think. And we actually have a colleague who's in Washington who is going to do a mock assembly. He was going to call it a student assembly, but I said, please, if it's not led by government, can we not create confusion? So it's now going to be a youth forum in September, and there are different schools in the city that we've tried to connect with him so that there are students from high schools that will be coming together. So it's a brilliant idea. One of the things that I've tried really hard to do since last year with the Middle East crisis, especially on campuses, is to find a university that is bold enough, that is courageous enough to be willing to do a student assembly on campus. And so far, we haven't been able to find one that's willing to do this. Although we're talking to about 7 different universities, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I said low-hanging fruit. We were going to do one at Ohio State University on mental health. Like, who Well, no, they said it was a woke issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
So-
see someone over here?
Yes. Mhm.
Was there a moment where it tipped and you observed that governments actually said, wow, this is really something we want to incorporate into our democracy? Like, how are we going to turn the heads of our elected officials here?
I mean, I think it's a great question. And I mean, for me as well, last year it was much more easy to be able to point to France and point to Ireland and point to Germany and say, you know, they're doing this and they're seeing good results. The German Bundestag, which is the national parliament in Germany, set up a permanent citizens' assembly last year. And they did this one time, and the issue was nutrition, and it went great. And when they were talking about the second mandate, and we worked very closely with the German Bundestag and the staff there, the second mandate for their second assembly, they thought about pandemic preparedness. And again, like, who could disagree with that? Who could think that it's not important to be prepared? But what happened is the German parties started to get really worried that this would cause finger pointing, and they completely removed it. And last week, just last week, they decided to reassign everybody that was with the Citizens Assembly group at the Bundestag. So for now, it's totally placed on hold. It's a really good question. I think Ireland is still a country that everybody looks like. Apparently, everyone in Ireland, when there's a public problem, they'll say, and this is kind of common, that we need a Citizens Assembly to solve this really real problem. But again, Ireland is not the United States. Far less complicated than we are in many ways. I think what we're seeing, especially since November's election, we had several conversations last year with the White House, and there was a lot of interest, not that there was a commitment to have a National Assembly, but there was a lot of interest in learning more about assemblies. I think what we're seeing right now is that it's really being pushed to the local level. And what I say often is that with all these assemblies that are starting to form across the US, we need strong proofs of concept. And I'm not sure that we're there right now. And part of that is because donors, where they are funding it, they're not funding it in a way that makes them really successful. And so these are all real struggles that we are all kind of working around. I do think Boulder is going to be very successful, and I'm really looking forward to the work that's going to be produced there. And we have at FIDE, we've received funding to do a learning series. So we're creating independent evaluations and doing case studies of the assemblies that are coming up so that we can really point to the problems, the challenges, the successes, so that we can all learn and hopefully over time see this happen more and more. But it's a good question. Even with Macron, as we saw, you know, when I was there working on the end of life, euthanasia and assisted suicide, was whether the question posed to 185 French citizens was, should the law change to include euthanasia and assisted suicide? And at the same time that people were deliberating around this, and they were taking their job very seriously, there were tons of protests outside around pension reform. And so what they were asking is, well, why are you asking us to kind of come and deliberate and propose recommendations on this, and why not pension reform? But of course, the government was unwilling to do that. So I do think that there are lots of these obstacles right now that are making both people feel a little bit uneasy about assemblies if they're not being asked to choose the topics. And also, we need government to show that there is policy impact at the end of the day. I mean, when we talk about the impacts of citizens' assemblies, we usually talk about them in 4 buckets. We talk about the policy impact, which is really important, and we need to see the recommendations in some shape or another become policy. Not all of them, but some of them at least. The second piece of it is the individual impact, you know, people changing, learning more, feeling like they have a greater sense of agency, voice, all of those things that we have kind of talked about throughout this hour. The third piece is societal, is this kind of the sense of collective the muscle around solving public problems. We don't do that anymore in our societies. And then the last one is institutional, and whether people's sort of relationship with government changes. Yes, sorry.
Forgive me if this question was asked while I was in the bathroom. What do you see as, sorry, let me rephrase this. What strategies do you see with citizens' assemblies
Mm.
And is there a case study, are there examples in the book of kind of de-escalation of kind of severe discord in given communities?
I mean, it's a great question. One of the issues that we have with the research that we have done across Europe right now around citizens' assemblies is that we don't look beyond the assembly members, right? So it's very hard for us to have, we don't have any data that shows how polarization changes. But we do have a lot of research that shows that even 2 hours of deliberation reduces levels of polarization. And we do see, I mean, you know, assembly members, one of the goals that I have for 2026 at FIDE North America is next year I want to set up an alum network, because as we're having all these assembly members across the country, they should be in touch with each other. All of them stay in touch. So in terms of the assembly itself, the sense of community that is created is exceptionally amazing. And so in that sense, definitely there's reduced polarization. People trust each other more. People are able to, I mean, you know, the active listening skills, the empathy skills that you learn throughout deliberation and throughout your experience at an assembly definitely reduces the polarization. But so far, it's really just limited to the assembly members. Of course.
We have time for 1 to 2 more, if anyone has any other questions. Okay, right here.
To sell? I mean, I don't, yeah, yes. Oh, yeah, so again, was asking, how do you go about creating that sense of belonging throughout the process of an assembly? And I don't know that I have like the roadmap to it, but I will tell you that I've seen time and time and time again that when you bring this representative sampling of people together who have never talked to each other, these are people who live in completely different neighborhoods, don't ever sit at the same table together. I think there are a couple of things that I will highlight. Like one of them, I think, and one of the biggest tricks, like even in France, where the issue was really polarizing. It was euthanasia and the end of life. Extremely emotional for all sorts of different reasons. People reacted to it on religious bases, on just family sort of connections to the issue and the idea. One of the tricks that we use, and sometimes it's subconscious and it just happens that way, is that you want to make sure, and I think you were kind of mentioning this a little bit, is when we bring them together initially, we want to build trust. So we don't dive right in to the issue that is going to separate them. What we do, for instance, in France, the first question we asked was, are the laws as they currently exist sufficient? And if not, what should be introduced? So should euthanasia and assisted suicide be introduced? So that brought them together around whether the existing laws around palliative care, whether they were sufficient or not. And it wasn't very tense. They were very comfortable talking to each other, even if they disagreed with each other, which they overwhelmingly did not. So it was a very unifying theme. And I think that allowed us to build a lot of trust. The other part of it, honestly, is just making sure that everybody has a voice. I mean, at the end of that process, and I keep going back to it because it was a beautifully executed process. At the end of that process, there was 24% were part of the minority who didn't want the law to change. They did not want euthanasia and assisted suicide to be introduced. And someone who was kind of became the spokesperson for the minority voice got up at the last session and she said, I want to thank the 70-some% who disagreed with us for giving us 50% of the time to speak. And so those types of decisions that we make in the design make sure that the group really, really is cohesive. And you know, people care. People, honestly, like what I have seen at least, and I'd love for one of you to disagree, is that when you bring people together around local issues and solving their local problems, they don't care that your political views are different. They're there to solve that issue. And that's what they're going to talk about. So I think that just breeds that sense of cohesion because you've asked them to come together and they take their job really, really seriously.
Okay, we can get both of you, no worries.
Oh.
Would you like to come or?
Mine's multiple.
Okay.
So what's the difference between this and citizens' juries, that's been around since 1971,
Mhm.
and like design charrettes that people use for environmental issues? Is it different? Is it
I'm not as familiar with the design of charrettes. I've seen a couple of them work, and I think those are also, there are lots of different processes for them. Citizens' juries are definitely far shorter. And so what we do, and you know, we have other types of things too, like there's the Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And then there's also deliberative town halls that are done. All of those, and I actually would sometimes argue with my colleagues about whether they truly are deliberative. Right? Because if you bring people together over 2 hours or 4 hours, can you really make a claim that you're really deliberating? I mean, even I will say Fort Collins just had their assembly and we were not involved, but it was over 4 days, 3 days? It was very, very short. It was 4 days. It was 4 days. And very difficult to come up with proposals that are well justified, that are actionable. And so I think that what we like about assemblies, and that's why, I mean, I'm a little bit of a purist, so I have like my minimum requirements. I will say nothing less than 6 days, because I've seen the way they've worked. And to me, the last thing you want to do is for these processes to backfire, to bring people together, and the end is a report that really, I mean, and I've seen electeds look at reports and say, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And that's not good design. So I think citizens' juries are very kind of, I would say, light touch in a way that assemblies are not. But again, they might solve, right? It's all about the problem you're trying to solve and the question you're asking, if that helps.
Yeah, I'm Mark. Hey, Marjan.
Hey.
You published an op-ed in the Boston Globe recently
Yes.
calling for a permanent citizens assembly. I think it was at the federal level.
A national one.
Could you did you already talk about that? Or
No.
Yeah. So could you talk about that? And
I'm happy to.
And I know there are permanent citizens assemblies in a couple other places like Paris and Eastern Belgium.
The city of Paris, yes.
Yes, the city of Paris. So you came up with a big idea, so I just want to hear your
Thank
thoughts.
you. I mean, that was more of a provocation. I think the point of the article was that, for me at least, was if this government that we are currently all living under is truly a populist government and really cares about representing the people, then they would launch a national citizens assembly. In the absence of that, perhaps we can, with philanthropy, set up a national assembly that of citizens of America across this country that are representative sampling that could at least act as some kind of a checks and balances kind of pillar. So that was kind of the idea. I didn't think that it would really, it was more, honestly, for me, it was more of a provocation and for something to put out there. Maybe a vision. I mean, I think we have a long way to go. I mean, as I said, I do believe in grassroots work. I have worked on them before. I've been on the oversight committee of them. For me, at this point in my life, I really wanted to kind of attach myself to processes that can show impact. And so I think for me, at this point, government needs to be a partner. So that was the issue. But you also mentioned the permanent assembly. So yes, the city of Paris. Does that mean we have to stop talking?
Tried to warn you, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's the air conditioning.
Yes.
Oh. So yes, there are also permanent assemblies in other places. So the city of Paris now has a permanent assembly of citizens, and they also experimented, and it was initially extremely rocky, and they had high turnover, and they weren't really sure what they're asking citizens, and they had a very small budget, which actually they still kind of have a small budget, but they have progressed, and they do have a permanent assembly. And the city of Belgium, and I was actually just in Belgium, and we were talking about the lessons learned from those permanent assemblies with the staff from the city that organizes them, and they've done an exceptional job with their permanent assemblies. But again, you know, very homogeneous. So different setups. And, you know, what I will say is that these things can absolutely be transformative, but we also have to accept that these are very experimental. And so how do we experiment with these things in a way that allows us to draw some real lessons each time so that we can improve on our practices? But thank you for being with us. I think we're going to
Of course,
start.
yes, we can wrap it up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to thank you all for joining us and thank Marjan for this wonderful discussion. We really appreciate you being here. I also want to remind you one more time that Activated Citizenship is here available for purchase. There's such a wealth of information in this book. We do encourage you to get it here with us, support your local indie bookstore. If you are going to buy a copy, it really does make a difference. And with that, we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the great questions.